Mother Grasshopper. In the year 1, we came in an armada of 1,000,000 spacecraft to settle upon, colonize, and claim for our homeland this giant grasshopper on which we now dwell. We dared not land upon the wings, for, though the cube-square rule held true and their most rapid motions would be imperceptible on a historic scale, random nerve firings resulted in pre-movement tremors measured at Richter 11. So we opted to build in the eyes, in the faceted mirror-lands that reflected infinities of flatness, a shimmering Iowa, the architecture of home. It was an impossible project, and one perhaps that was doomed from the start, but such things are obvious only in retrospect. We were a young and vigorous race then. Everything seemed possible. Using shaped temporal fields, we force-grew trees which we cut down to build our cabins. We planted sod and wheat and buffalo. In one vivid and unforgettable night of technology, we created a layer of limestone bedrock 1/2 a mile deep upon which to build our towns. And when our work was done, we held hoedowns in 1,000 county seats all across the islands. We created new seasons, including snow, after the patterns of those we had known in antiquity, but the night sky we left unaltered, for this was to be our home, now and forever. The unfamiliar constellations would grow their own legends over the ages. There would be time. Generations passed, and cities grew with whorls of suburbs, like the arms of spiral galaxies around them, for we were lonely, as were the thousands and millions we decanted, who grew like the trees of the Cisacellar plains that were as thick as the ancient Black Forest. I was a young man, newly bearded, hardly much more than a shirt-tail child on that harvest day when the stranger walked into town. This was so unusual an event, and for you to whom a town of 10,000 necessarily means that there will be strangers, I despair of explaining, that children came out to shout and run at his heels, while we older citizens, conscious of our dignity, stood in the doorways of our shops, factories, and co-ops, to gaze ponderously in his general direction, not quite at him, you understand, but over his shoulder into the flat, mesmeric plains, and the infinite white skies beyond. He claimed to have come all the way from the equatorial abdomen, where gravity is 3 times I-normal, and this was easy enough to believe, for he was ungodly strong. With my own eyes, I once saw him take a $1 coin between thumb and forefinger and bend it in half, and a steel dollar at that. He also claimed to have walked the entire distance, which nobody believed, not even me. "If you'd walked even half that far," I said, "I reckon you'd be the most remarkable man as ever lived." He laughed at that and ruffled my hair. "Well, maybe I am," he said. "Maybe I am." I flushed and took a step backwards, hand on the bandersnatch skin hilt of my fighting knife. I was as feisty as a bantam rooster in those days, and twice as quick to take offense. "Mister, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." The stranger looked at me. Then he reached out and, without the slightest hint of fear or anger or even regret, touched my arm just below the shoulder. He did it with no particular speed, and yet somehow I could not react fast enough to stop him. And that touch, light though it was, paralyzed my arm, leaving it withered and useless, even as it is today. He put his drink down on the bar and said, "Pick up my knapsack." I did. "Follow me." So it was that, without a word of farewell to my family, or even a backward glance, I left New Auschwitz forever. That night, over a campfire of eelgrass and dried buffalo chips, we ate a dinner of refried beans and fatback bacon. It was a new and clumsy experience for me, eating one-handed. For a long time, neither one of us spoke. Finally, I said, "Are you a magician?" The stranger sighed. "Maybe so," he said. "Maybe I am." "You have a name?" "No." "What do we do now?" "Business." He pushed his plate toward me. "I cooked. It's your turn to wash." Our business entailed constant travel. We went to Brinkerton with cholera and to Roxborough with typhus. We passed through Denver and Venice and St. Petersburg and left behind fleas, rats, and plague. In Upper Black Eddy it was Ebola. We never stayed long enough to see the results of our work, but I read the newspapers afterwards, and it was about what you would expect. Still, on the whole, humanity prospered. Where one city was decimated, another was expanding. The overspilling hospitals of one county created a market for the goods of a dozen others. The survivors had babies. We walked to Tylersburg, Rutledge, and Uniontown, and took wagons to Shoemakersville, Confluence, and South Gibson, booked onto steam trains for Mount Lebanon, Mount Bethel, Mount Etna, and Mount Nebo, and diesel trains to McKeesport, Reinhold Station, and Broomall. Boarded buses to Carbondale, Feasterville, Junebug, and Lincoln Falls. Caught commuter flights to Paradise, Nickel Mines, Niantic, and Zion. The time passed quickly. Then one shocking day my magician announced that he was going home. "Home," I said. "What about your work?" "Our work, Daniel," he said gently. "I expect you'll do as good a job as ever I did." He finished packing his few possessions into a carpet bag. "You can't," I cried. With a wink and a sad smile, he slipped out the door. For a time, long or short, I don't know, I sat motionless, unthinking, unseeing. Then I leaped to my feet, threw open the door, and looked up and down the empty street. Blocks away toward the train station was a scurrying black speck. Leaving the door open behind me, I ran after it. I just missed the afternoon express to Lackawanna. I asked the station master when was the next train after it. He said tomorrow. Had he seen a tall man carrying a carpet bag, looking thus and so? Yes, he had. Where was he? On the train to Lackawanna. Nothing more, heading that way today. Did he know where I could rent a car? Yes, he did. Place just down the road. Maybe I'd have caught the magician if I hadn't gone back to the room to pick up my bags. Most likely not. At Lackawanna Station, I found he'd taken the bus to Johnstown. In Johnstown, he'd moved on to Erie, and there the trail ran cold. It took me 3 days hard questioning to pick it up again. For a week I pursued him thus, like a man possessed. Then I awoke one morning and my panic was gone. I knew I wasn't going to catch my magician any time soon. I took stock of my resources, counted up what little cash money I had, and laid out a strategy. Then I went shopping. Finally, I hit the road. I'd have to be patient, dogged, wily, but I knew that, given enough time, I'd find him. Find him, and kill him, too. The trail led me to Harper's Ferry at the very edge of the Oculus. Behind was civilization. Ahead was nothing but thousands of miles of empty chitin lands. People said he'd gone south, off the lens entirely. Back at my boarding house, I was approached by one of the lodgers. He was a skinny man with a big mustache and sleeveless white T-shirt that hung from his skinny shoulders like wet laundry on a muggy Sunday. "What you got in that bag?" "Black Death," I said. "Infectious meningitis, tuberculosis, you name it." He thought for a bit. "I got this wife," he said at last. "I don't suppose you could—" "I'll take a look at her," I said, and hoisted the bag. We went upstairs to his room. She lay in the bed, eyes closed. There was an IV needle in her arm, hooked up to a drip feed. She looked young, but of course that meant nothing. Her hair, neatly brushed and combed, laid across the coverlet almost to her waist, was white as snow, as death, as finest bone china. "How long has she been like this?" I asked. "Oh," he blew out his cheeks. 47, maybe 50 years. "You her father?" "Husband. Was, anyhow. Not sure how long the vows were meant to hold up under these conditions. Can't say I've kept 'em any too well. You got something in that bag for her?" He said it as casual as he could, but his eyes were big and spooked-looking. I made my decision. "Tell you what," I said. "I'll give you $40 for her." "The sheriff wouldn't think much of what you just said," the man said, low and quiet. "No, but then I suppose I'll be off of the islands entirely before he knows a word of it." I picked up my syringe. "Well, is it a deal or not?" Her name was Victoria. We were a good 3 days' march into the chitin before she came out of the trance state characteristic of the interim zombie stage of recovery. I'd fitted her with a pack, walking shoes, and a good stout stick, and she strode along head up, eyes blank, speaking in the tongues of angels afloat between the stars. "Cisgalactic phase intercept," she said. "Do you read? Das Überraumboot zurückgegenerinnerte. Verstehen? Anademonic mesotechnological conflict strategizing. 3000 Affen mit Lasern. Hello? Is anybody—" Then she stumbled over a rock, cried out in pain, and said, "Where am I?" I stopped, spread a map on the ground, and got out my pocket gravitometer. It was a simple thing, a glass cylinder filled with aerogel and a bright orange ceramic bead. The casing was tin with a compressor screw at the top, a calibrated scale along the side, and the words Flynn and Company at the bottom. I flipped it over, watched the bead slowly fall. I tightened the screw a notch, then 2, then 3, increasing the aerogel's density. At 5, the bead stopped. I read the gauge, squinted up at the sun, and then jabbed a finger on an ISO bar to one edge of the map. "Right here," I said. "Just off the lens, see?" "I don't—" She was trembling with panic. Her dilated eyes shifted wildly from one part of the empty horizon to another. Then suddenly, sourcelessly, she burst into tears. Embarrassed, I looked away. When she was done crying, I patted the ground. "Sit." Sniffling, she obeyed. "How old are you, Victoria?" "How old am— 16, she said tentatively. 17? Then, "Is that really my name?" "It was. The woman you were grew tired of life and injected herself with a drug that destroys the ego and with it all trace of personal history," I sighed. "So in one sense you're still Victoria, and in another sense you're not. What she did was illegal, though. You can never go back to the Oculus. You'd be locked into jail for the rest of your life." She looked at me through eyes newly young, almost childlike in their experience, and still wet with tears. I was prepared for hysteria, grief, rage, but all she said was, "Are you a magician?" That rocked me back on my heels. "Well, yes," I said. "I suppose I am." She considered that silently for a moment. "So what happens to me now?" "Your job is to carry that pack. We also go turn on turn with the dishes." I straightened, folding the map. "Come on, we've got a far way yet to go." But then, not many miles down the road, and to my complete astonishment, Victoria began to sing. Victoria began to sing. We followed the faintest of paths, less a trail than the memory of a dream of the idea of one, across the chiton. Alongside it grew an occasional patch of grass. A lot of wind-blown loess had swept across the chitonlands over the centuries. It caught in cracks in the carapace and gave purchase to fortuitous seeds. Once I even saw a rabbit. But before I could point it out to Victoria, I saw something else. Up ahead, in a place where the shell had powdered and a rare rainstorm had turned the powder briefly to mud, were 2 overlapping tire prints. A motorbike had been by here, and recently. I stared at the tracks for a long time, clenching and unclenching my good hand. The very next day we came upon a settlement. It was a hardscrabble place. Just a windmill to run the pump that brought up a trickle of ichor from a miles-deep well, a refinery to process the stuff edible, and a handful of unpainted clapboard buildings and Quonset huts. Several battered old pickup trucks sat rusting under the limitless sky. A gaunt man stood by the gate waiting for us. His jaw was hard, his backbone straight, and his hands empty, but I noted here and there a shiver of movement in a window or from the open door of a shed, and I made no mistake but that there were weapons trained upon us. "Name's Rivera," the man said when we came up to him. I swept off my bowler hat. "Daniel, this is Miss Victoria, my ward." "Passing through?" "Yes, sir, I am, and I see no reason I should ever pass this way again. If you have food for sale, I'll pay you market rates. But if not, why, with your permission, we'll just keep on moving on." "Fair spoken." From somewhere, Rivera produced a cup of water and handed it to us. I drank half, handed the rest to Victoria. She shivered as it went down. "Right good," I said. "And cold, too." "We have a heat pump," Rivera said with grudging pride. "Come on inside. Let's see what the women have made us to eat." Then the children came running out, whooping and hollering, too many to count, and the adult people behind them, whom I made out to be 20 in number. They made us welcome. They were good people, if outlaws, and as hungry for news and gossip as anybody can be. I told them about a stump speech I had heard made by Tyler B. Morris, who was running for governor of the Northern Department, and they spent all of dinner time discussing it. The food was good, too, ham and biscuits with red-eye gravy, sweet yams with butter, and apple cobbler to boot. If I hadn't seen their chemical complex, I'd have never guessed it for synthetic. There were lace curtains in the window, brittle old but clean, and I noted how carefully the leftovers were stored away for later. After we'd eaten, Rivera caught my eye and gestured with his chin. We went outside, and he led me to a shed out back. He unpadlocked the door, and we stepped within. A line of 10 people lay unmoving on plain-built beds. They were each catheterized to a drip bag of processed ichor. Light from the door caught their hair, 10 white halos in the gloom.
"We brought them with us," Rivera said. "Thought we'd be doing well enough to make a go of it. Lately, though, I don't know, maybe it's the drought, but the blood's been running thin, and it's not like we have the money to have a new well drilled."
"I understand." Then, because it seemed a good time to ask, "There was a man came by this way probably less than a week ago, tall, riding a—"
"He wouldn't help,"
Harry said.
"Said it wasn't his responsibility. Then before he drove off, the son of a bitch tried to buy some of our food."
He turned and spat.
"He told us you and the woman would be coming along. We've been waiting."
"Wait, he told you I'd have a woman with me?"
"It's not just us we have to think of,"
he said with sudden vehemence.
"There's the young fellers, too. They come along, and all a man's stiff-necked talk about obligations and morality goes right out the window. Sometimes I think how I could come out here with a length of iron pipe and, well—"
He shook his head and then almost pleadingly said,
"Can't you do something?"
"I think so." A faint creaking noise made me turn then. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway. The light through her hair made of it a white flare. I closed my eyes, wishing she hadn't stumbled across this thing. In a neutral voice, I said, "Get my bag." Then Rivera and I set to haggling out a price. We left the settlement with a goodly store of food and driving their third-best pickup truck. It was a pathetic old thing, and the shocks were scarce more than a memory. We bumped and jolted toward the south. For a long time Victoria did not speak. Then she turned to me and angrily blurted, "You killed them!"
"It was what they wanted."
"How can you say that?" She twisted in the seat and punched me in the shoulder, hard. "How can you sit there and say that?" "Look," I said testily, "it's simple mathematics. You could make an equation out of it. They can only drill so much ichor. That ichor makes only so much food. Divide that by the number of mouths there are to feed and hold up the result against what it takes to keep one alive. So much food, so many people. If the one's smaller than the other, you starve. And the children wanted to live. The folks in the shed didn't." "They could go back. Nobody has to live out in the middle of nowhere trying to scratch food out of nothing." "I counted 1 suicide for every 2 waking adults. Just how welcome do you think they'd be back to the Oculus with so many suicides living among them? More than likely that's what drove them out here in the first place." "Well, nobody would be starving if they didn't insist on having so many damn children." "How can you stop people from having children?" I asked. There was no possible answer to that, and we both knew it. Victoria leaned her head against the cab window, eyes squeezed tight shut, as far from me as she could get. "You could have woken them up, but no, you had your bag of goodies and you wanted to play. I'm surprised you didn't kill me when you had the chance." "Vicky, don't speak to me." She started to weep. I wanted to hug her and comfort her, she was so miserable, but I was driving and I only had the one good arm. So I didn't. Nor did I explain to her why it was that nobody chose to simply wake the suicides up. That evening, as usual, I got out the hatchet and splintered enough chitin for a campfire. I was sitting by it, silent, when Victoria got out the jug of rough liquor the settlement folks had brewed from ichor. "You be careful with that stuff," I said. "It sneaks up on you. Don't forget whatever experience you've had drinking got left behind in your first life." "Then you drink," she said, thrusting a cup at me. "I'll follow your lead. When you stop, I'll stop." I swear I never suspected what she had in mind, and it had been a long while since I'd tasted alcohol. So, like a fool, I took her intent at face value. I had a drink, and then another. Time passed. We talked some, we laughed some, maybe we sang a song or two. Then somehow Victoria had shucked off her blouse and was dancing. She whirled around the campfire, her long skirts lifting up above her knees and occasionally flirting through the flames, so that the hem browned and smoked but never quite caught fire. This wildness seemed to come out of nowhere. I watched her, alarmed and aroused, too drunk to think clearly, too entranced even to move. Finally she collapsed gracefully at my feet. The firelight was red on her naked back, shifting with each gasping breath she took. She looked up at me through her long, sweat-tangled hair, and her eyes were like amber, dark as cypress swamp water, brown and bottomless. eyes a man could drown in. I pulled her toward me. Laughing, she surged forward, collapsing upon me, tumbling me over backwards, fumbling with my belt and then the fly of my jeans. Then she had my cock out and stiff, and I'd pushed her skirt up above her waist, so that it seemed she was wearing nothing but a thick red sash, and I rolled her over on her back, and she was reaching down between her legs to guide me in, and she was smiling and lovely. I plunged deep, deep, deep into her, and oh God, but it felt fine, like that eye-opening shock you get when you plunge into a cold lake for the first time on a hot summer's day and the water wraps itself around you and feels so impossibly good, only this was warm and slippery slick, and 1,000 times better. Then I was telling her things, telling her I needed her, I wanted her, I loved her, over and over again. I awoke the next morning with a raging hangover. Victoria was sitting in the cab of the pickup, brushing her long white hair in the rearview mirror and humming to herself. "Well," she said, amused, "look what the cat dragged in. There's water in the jerry cans. Have yourself a drink. I expect we could also spare a cup for you to wash your face with." "Look," I said, "I'm sorry about last night." "No, you're not." "I maybe said some foolish things, but—" Her eyes flashed storm-cloud dark. "You weren't speaking near so foolish then as you are now. You meant every damn word, and I'm holding you to them." Then she laughed. "You best get out that water. You look hideous." So I dragged myself off. Overnight, Victoria had changed. Her whole manner, the way she held herself, even the way she phrased her words, told me that she wasn't a child anymore. She was a woman. The thing I'd been dreading had begun. "Resistance is useless," Victoria read, "for mine is the might and power of the cosmos itself." She'd found a comic book stuck back under the seat and gone through it 3 times, chuckling to herself, while the truck rattled down that near non-existent road. Now she put it down. "Tell me something," she said. "How do you know your magician came by this way?" "I just know is all," I said curtly. I'd given myself a shot of B-complex vitamins, but my head and gut still felt pretty ragged. Nor was it particularly soothing having to drive this idiot truck one-armed. And anyway, I couldn't say just how I knew. It was a feeling I had, a certainty. "I had a dream last night, after we, danced." I didn't look at her. "I was on a flat platform, like a railroad station, only enormous. It stretched halfway to infinity. There were stars all around me, thicker and more colorful than I'd ever imagined them, bright enough to make your eyes ache. Enormous machines were everywhere, golden, spaceships, I suppose. They were taking off and landing with delicate little puffs of air, like it was the easiest thing imaginable to do. My body was so light I felt like I was going to float up among them. You ever hear of a place like that?" "No." "There was a man waiting for me there. He had the saddest smile, but cold, cruel eyes. 'Hello, Victoria,' he said. 'And how did you know my name?' I asked. 'Oh, I keep a close eye on Daniel,' he said. 'I'm grooming him for an important job.' Then he showed me a syringe. 'Do you know what's in here?' he asked me. The liquid in it was so blue it shone." She fell silent. "What did you say?" I just shook my head. "Mortality," he said. "It's an improved version of the drug you shot yourself up with 50 years ago. Tell Daniel it'll be waiting for him at Sky Terminus, where the great ships come and go." That was all. You think it means anything? I shook my head. She picked up the comic book, flipped it open again. "Well, anyway, it was a strange dream." That night, after doing the dishes, I went and sat down on the pickup sideboard and stared into the fire, thinking. Victoria came and sat down beside me. She put a hand on my leg. It was the lightest of touches, but it sent all my blood rushing to my cock. She smiled at that and looked up into my eyes. "Resistance is useless," she said. Afterwards we lay together between blankets on the ground, looking up at the night sky. It came to me then that being taken away from normal life, young as I had been, all my experience with love had come before the event, and all my experience with sex after, and that I'd therefore never before known them both together, so that in this situation I was as naive and unprepared for what was happening to us as Victoria was, which was how I admitted to myself I loved Victoria. At the time it seemed the worst possible thing that could have happened to me. We saw it for the first time that next afternoon. It began as a giddy feeling, like a mild case of vertigo, and a vague thickening at the center of the sky as if it were going dark from the inside out. This was accompanied by a bulging up of the horizon, as if God himself had placed hands flat on either edge and leaned forward, bowing it upward. Then my inner ear knew that the land which had been flat as flat for all these many miles was now slanting downhill all the way to the horizon. That was the gravitational influence of all that mass before us. Late into the day it just appeared. It was like a conjuring trick. One moment it wasn't there at all, and then, with the slightest of perceptual shifts, it dominated the vision. It was so distant that it took on the milky backscatter color of the sky, and it went up so high you literally couldn't see the top. It was, I knew this now, our destination. The antenna. Even driving the pickup truck, it took 3 days after first sighting to reach its base. On the morning of one of those days, Victoria suddenly pushed aside her breakfast and ran for the far side of the truck, that being the only privacy to be had for hundreds of miles around. I listened to her retching, knowing there was only one thing it could be. She came back pale and shaken. I got a plastic collection cup out of my bag. "Pee into this," I told her. When she had, I ran a quick diagnostic. It came up positive. "Victoria," I said, "I've got an admission to make. I haven't been exactly straight with you about the medical consequences of your condition." It was the only time I ever saw her afraid. "My God," she said. "What is it? Tell me, what's happening to me?" "Well, to begin with, you're pregnant." There were no roads to the terminus, for all that it was visible from miles off. It lay nestled at the base of the antenna, and to look at the empty and trackless plains about it, you'd think there was neither reason for its existence nor possibility of any significant traffic there. Yet the closer we got, the more people we saw approaching it. They appeared out of the everywhere and nothingness like hydrogen atoms being pulled into existence in the stressed spaces between galaxies, or like shards of ice crystallizing at random in supercooled, superpure water. You'd see one far to your left, maybe strolling along with a walking stick slung casually over one shoulder, and a gait that just told you she was whistling. Then beyond her in the distance a puff of dust from what could only be a half-track. And to the right a man in a wide-brimmed hat sitting ramrod straight in the saddle of a native parasite larger than any elephant, with every hour a different configuration, and all converging. Roads materialized underfoot. By the time we arrived at the terminus, they were thronged with people. The terminal building itself was as large as a city, all gleaming white marble arches and colonnades and parapets and towers. Pennants snapped in the wind. Welcoming musicians played at the feet of the columns. An enormous holographic banner, dopplering slowly through the rainbow from infrared to ultraviolet and back again, read, "Byzantium Port Authority, Magnetic Levitation Mass Transit Division, Ground Terminus." Somebody later told me it provided employment for 100,000 people, and I believed him. Victoria and I parked the truck by the front steps. I opened the door for her and helped her gingerly out. Her belly was enormous by then, and her sense of balance was off. We started up the steps. Behind us, a uniformed lackey got in the pickup and drove it away. The space within was grander than could have been supported had the terminus not been located at the cusp of antenna and forehead, where the proximate masses each cancelled out much of the other's attraction. There were countless ticket windows, all of carved mahogany. I settled Victoria down on a bench. Her feet were tender, and went to stand in line. When I got to the front, the ticket-taker glanced at a computer screen and said, "May I help you, sir?" "2 tickets, first class. Up." He tapped at the keyboard, and a little device spat out 2 crisp pasteboard tickets. He slid them across the polished brass counter, and I reached for my wallet. "How much?" I said. He glanced at his computer and shook his head. "No charge for you, Mr. Daniel. Professional courtesy." "How did you know my name?" "You're expected." Then, before I could ask any more questions, "That's all I can tell you, sir. I can neither speak nor understand your language. It is impossible for me to converse with you." "Then what the hell," I said testily, "are we doing now?" He flipped the screen around for me to see. On it was a verbatim transcript of our conversation. The last line was, "I simply read what's on the screen, sir." Then he turned it back toward himself and said, "I simply read what's—" Yeah, I know," I said, and went back to Victoria. Even at maglev speeds, it took 2 days to travel the full length of the antenna. To amuse myself, I periodically took out my gravitometer and made readings. You'd think the figures would diminish exponentially as we climbed out of the gravity well, but because the antennae swept backward over the bulk of the Grasshopper, rather than forward and away, the gravitational gradient of our journey was quite complex. It lessened rapidly at first, grew temporarily stronger, and then lessened again, in the complex and lovely flattening sine wave known as a Sheffield curve. You could see it reflected in the size of the magnetic rings we flashed through, 3 per minute, how they grew skinnier, then fatter, and finally skinnier still as we flew upward. On the second day, Victoria gave birth. It was a beautiful child, a boy. I wanted to name him Hector after my father, but Victoria was set on Jonathan, and as usual I gave in to her. Afterwards, though, I studied her features. There were crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, or maybe laugh lines is more appropriate, given Victoria's personality. The lines to either side of her mouth had deepened. Her whole face had a haggard cast to it. Looking at her, I felt a sadness so large and pervasive it seemed to fill the universe. She was aging along her own exponential curve. The process was accelerating now, and I was not at all certain she would make it to Sky Terminus. It would be a close thing in either case. I could see that Victoria knew it too, but she was happy as she hugged our child. "It's been a good life," she said. "I wish you could have grown with me. Don't pout. You're so solemn, Daniel, but other than that I have no complaints." I looked out the window for a minute. I had known her for only, a week maybe? But in that brief time she had picked me up, shaken me off, and turned my life around. She had changed everything. When I looked back, I was crying. "Death is the price we pay for children, isn't it?" she said. "Down below they've made death illegal, but they're only fooling themselves. They think it's possible to live forever. They think there are no limits to growth, but everything dies. People, stars, the universe. And once it's over, all lives are the same length." "I guess I'm just not so philosophical as you. It's a damned hard thing to lose your wife." "Well, at least you figured that one out." "What one?" "That I'm your wife." She was silent a moment. Then she said, "I had another dream, about your magician, and he explained about the drug, the one he called mortality." "Huh," I said, not really caring. "The drug I took, you wake up and you burn through your life in a matter of days. With the new version, you wake up with a normal human lifespan, the length people had before the immortality treatments. 150, 200 years. That's not so immediate. The suicides are kept alive because their deaths come on so soon. It's too shocking to the survivors' sensibilities. The new version shows its effects too slowly to be stopped." I stroked her long white hair, so fine, so very, very brittle. "Let's not talk about any of this." Her eyes blazed. "Let's do. Don't pretend to be a fool, Daniel. People multiply. There's only so much food, water, space. If nobody dies, there'll come a time when everybody dies." Then she smiled again, fondly, the way you might at a petulant but still promising child. "You know what's required of you, Daniel, and I'm proud of you for being worthy of it." Sky Terminus was enormous, dazzling, beyond description. It was exactly like in Vicky's dream. I helped her out onto the platform. She could barely stand by then, but her eyes were bright and curious. Jonathan was asleep against my chest in a baby sling. Whatever held the atmosphere to the platform, it offered no resistance to the glittering, brilliantly articulated ships that rose and descended from all parts. Strange cargoes were unloaded by even stranger longshoremen. "I'm not as excited by all this as I would have been when I was younger," Victoria murmured, "but somehow I find it more satisfying. Does that make sense to you?" I began to say something, but then abruptly the light went out of her eyes. Stiffening, she stared straight ahead of herself into nothing that I could see. There was no emotion in her face whatsoever. "Vicky," I said. Slowly she tumbled to the ground. It was then, while I stood stunned and unbelieving, that the magician came walking up to me. In my imagination I'd run through this scene 1,000 times. Leaving my bag behind, I stumbled off the train toward him. He made no move to escape. I flipped open my jacket with a shrug of the shoulder, drew out the revolver with my good hand, and fired. Now, though, he looked sadly down at Victoria's body and put an arm around my shoulders. "God," he said, "don't they just break your heart?" I stayed on a month at the Sky Terminus to watch my son grow up. Jonathan died without offspring, and was given an orbital burial. His coffin circled the Grasshopper 7 times before the orbit decayed and it scratched a bright meteoric line down into the night. The flare lasted about as long as would a struck sulfur match. He'd been a good man, with a wicked sense of humor that never came from my side of the family. So now I wander the world. Civilizations rise and fall about me, only I remain unchanged. Where things haven't gotten too bad, I scatter mortality. Where they have, I unleash disease. I go where I go, and I do my job. The generations rise up like wheat before me, and like a harvester I mow them down. Sometimes, not often, I go off by myself to think and remember. Then I stare up into the night, into the colonized universe, until the tears rise up in my sight and drown the swarming stars. I am death, and this is my story.